Hi. We're going to be talking about the Instruo CSL today, but not in a, oh hey, here's the CSL within the framework of a complex oscillator kind of way. Rather, we're going to look at the face value audio processing capabilities it offers as a module and examine every one of them in depth from the point of view of a sound designer and a musician. Then, we're going to look at how everything blends together into a truly beautiful design, and in my opinion, one of the best complex oscillators out there today. I'll also be looking at its limitations, which are mostly due to it being an analog module, but that's for later. Alright, so a quick rundown of the different oscillators. Oscillator A is a saw core, which is capable of hard sync, and oscillator B is a triangle core capable of soft sync. Let's listen to the different outputs. Oscillator A's outputs are the top ones here, down until the multiply output, and oscillator B's outputs are at the bottom here, up until the multiply output. So the final outputs are both for their individual oscillators. That's the normaling. Let's check out the sine wave from oscillator A. Not a very clean sine wave, and that's because of the sawtooth core. As you can see in the spectrogram over there, you have quite a bit of artifacts going all the way up. These are saw-like artifacts, and we're going to explore what those actually sound like using an upwards compressor with a crossover. Triangle wave, if we zoom into it a little bit, you're going to see that it has this little notch at the bottom. See in the scope? This is another saw-like artifact. If you look at the spectrogram, it does actually add quite a bit of additional harmonics. I see these as a good thing, as you are also offered a cleaner triangle and a cleaner sine wave at the bottom here. But again, this is an analog oscillator, and it has character even in the simplest waveforms. And if you are looking for an absolutely clean, clear, pristine triangle or a pristine sine wave, you're not going to get that here. Except maybe actually the triangle from this oscillator is very good. So we're going to look at that soon. The sawtooth from the oscillator A is amazing. Sounds great. Also has that little bit of resonant point at the bottom of the sawtooth, which sounds nice. And as you can expect from an analog oscillator, it really goes down and remains pristine. Very pure sound, very clean sawtooth. The final output through the wavefolder, when we turn it up, as you can see, it's the sine wave from oscillator A that's normaled in here. The bias knobs are very, very sensitive, so I'll just kind of move that to a nice position there. There we go. And as you can see, it's just a sine wave. We're going to explore the wavefolders separately. They're very nice wavefolders. Then going to oscillator B, a sine wave. It is quite a bit cleaner than oscillator A's sine wave, just showing you a difference in the added harmonics. Very, very clean. These are triangle-like artifacts, by the way. We're going to listen to what those sound like later. The square wave, very clean, very nice. Almost no added artifacts. Triangle wave, pristine, and just a tiny bit, if you look there, just a tiny bit of artifacts. Sounds really nice, very nice triangle. Final output, again, sounds exactly the same as the other one, but it's with the oscillator B's sine wave. Let me reset the bias again. Very clean, nice wavefolder. The PWM outputs from oscillator A, you get a square wave with artifacts again. See those? Little notches at the center of the square. And then when we switch around the PWM, modulatable with this CV input. And then going to the bottom PWM circuit, you get this stepped triangle. You can silence these completely with extreme voltages in the CV input, but otherwise does not act as an attenuator. The voltage here sums with this knob, actually making it easier to completely silence the signal. Alright, so now for a quick example. What I have here is a multipass open with a crossover that has dynamics in it. It's just upwardly compressing the band that it's in. Once I enable it, you'll see how the noise floor just rockets into audible levels. What it does essentially when it upwards compresses, we're going to be able to hear the harmonics as I separate them from the lower band, which is not being processed. And as I move the band around, you're going to be able to hear all the artifacts that are added into the basic wave shapes coming out of each oscillator. So here I have the basic sine wave coming from oscillator A, and now I'm going to sweep the band up and you're going to hear the harmonics come in. And these are all the additional harmonics added in by just being a saw core oscillator. And when you hear the sawtooth later, you can just A-B between this and the sawtooth. You'll see how these harmonics are similar. Now I'm going to go into the triangle output from the oscillator A, and I'll sweep up. And again, we're going to hear those additional artifacts. The sawtooth output. This is much cleaner, obviously, because it's a saw core oscillator. Now to oscillator B's sine wave, and here you can see it's cleaner, but these additional artifacts are from the triangle core, so they sound kind of triangle-like. The square output, and for the triangle output, these are the artifacts added in. Let's take a quick look at sync. As I said before, oscillator A is capable of hard sync, oscillator B is capable of soft sync. So let me quickly show you the triangle here. I'm going to pan that to the left, and then I'm going to show you the square wave on the right channel from oscillator B so you can know exactly how they sync up together. Now we're listening to both waveforms. This is oscillator B, this is oscillator A, and when I turn on the white hard sync using this button, you can see how oscillator B nicely resets oscillator A with a hard reset. And when we turn up the frequency on oscillator B, you can see that it starts slicing into the waveform of oscillator A. So essentially what we're doing is we're shortening the wave window. And then when it reaches high enough frequencies, it cuts it way closer to the zero crossing here. And eventually it just goes quiet. This knob essentially turns into a hard sync ratio. And if I increase the frequency of oscillator A within oscillator B's hard sync window right here, which is indicated by the square wave, you'll see that we're increasing the number of wave cycles per wave window in oscillator A before it has to reset from the hard sync. And that's hard sync. And now we're going to take a look at soft sync. I'm going to take the triangle wave output on the right side from oscillator B, and on the left side I'm going to give you the sawtooth from oscillator A, and I'm going to turn the sync to soft sync. So now oscillator B is soft synced to oscillator A, meaning it reverses its charge direction every time oscillator A has a rising or falling edge. If I increase the frequency of oscillator A, it doesn't really change the frequency of oscillator B, as you can see. But what soft sync enables us is to not really harm the original waveform, but it does allow us to lock it into harmonic frequency intervals from the source of the sync. See? So if you look at the spectrogram, when we're outside of these harmonic intervals, the soft sync creates these artifacts in the sound. It adds these additional sidebands, which we won't necessarily like to hear, but also they can sound pretty good if that's what you intend to do. So this is when they're kind of out of tune. And as you can see, it cleanly locks into this harmonic interval once we find another one because of the soft sync. Once we find these harmonic intervals, the sound cleans up, and this is kind of called frequency lock or X-lock. And another one that we just found where their frequencies are identical. And that's what soft sync does. It creates this frequency relationship between the two, which is easier to find harmonic intervals with. Looking at the multiplication circuit right here, it includes these two inputs, this output, this knob, and this button. This is the carrier input, and this is the modulator input. You can essentially think of this as some sort of bipolar VCA, where the modulator controls the depth of the VCA, and the carrier just goes through it and out the multiply output. You select the nature of the crossmodding using this button, and the depth of the crossmodding using this knob. So oscillator B's sine wave is normaled into the carrier input of the multiplication circuit, and oscillator A's sine wave is normaled into the modulator. So we're going to plug into the multiply output to listen to what it sounds like. So normally, when the knob is set to 0, you get complete silence. When you start turning it up to the 2 o'clock position right here, you can think of this line as the marker for the 2 o'clock position. This would be unity gain. And past this point, it would kind of softly clip the signal a little bit. When this LED is gray, you get ring modding, meaning when the modulator sends the VCA into negative values, it is flipping the carrier's polarity when the modulator is going negative. So you get this nice ring modding timbre And if we change the ratio between the two, you can see that oscillator A essentially controls the overall amplitude of what oscillator B is putting through. So oscillator B is what you are seeing pulsing within oscillator A's waveform. You can think of it like that. So oscillator A is the slower one, which is going up and down very slow, affecting oscillator B's amplitude, which is the wave that's going fast. This creates these interesting sidebands here, which mathematically represent the sum and difference of the input waveforms. Switching to the next type of crossmodding, when you click it once, white represents AM. With AM, the modulator input is half-wave rectified, meaning when it reaches 0, the VCA that controls the amplitude of the carrier puts out silence. So if we reduce the frequency of oscillator A, we can see the negative portions of it causing silence to appear. And that's what creates the traditional AM. And of course, within this positive amplitude window, we can change whatever's going on in there. You can imagine that whatever we plug into the carrier input will be affected by oscillator A, normaled into the modulator input. So we're going to check out the third mode, which would be full wave rectification of the modulator. In this case, it's kind of similar to ring modding with the added difference that it does not invert the carrier when the modulator goes negative, because it is full wave rectified. So instead, you get this kind of a different relationship. You would say that this method is similar to ring modding, but it is not. When you look at the scope, it seems quite similar, but the inversion adds quite a bit of a difference in ring modding. And that can be seen when you look at it in the frequency domain right here in this spectrogram. So when I move from rect to ring modding, you can see how harmonically different the two sounds are when the phase is inverted. So you could think of these as just different timbres of cross-modding between the oscillators, or as a layering tool, especially with AM and full rectification. So I'll give you an example now. Instead of connecting oscillator B into the carrier input, we're going to just plug in some blue noise modulated by oscillator A. When we turn up this knob, we can see that the noise is affected by the oscillator. And going into AM, you can see the tiny little troughs between the peaks of the noise because oscillator A goes negative and sends it into silence there. So you can think of this circuit as a nice way to layer sounds together when using multiple outputs coming out of the CSL. So now we're going to take a look at the wavefolders, and both of them are identical, but they are internally normal to their oscillators on their individual sides. So we're going to plug into oscillator A's output. The final output of oscillator A goes through the wavefolder. When you connect into it and it's at the minimum value, you can see that it kind of clamps shut and you get silence over there. This is because this is also an overdrive circuit, and we're going to look at that soon. So when you start pushing up on the knob, you get the original waveform at about a third of the way through. Then past this point, you reach a certain threshold where the wave starts folding over itself. So this would be the first stage of the wavefolder. Stage 1, stage 2, as it folds over again. Stage 3. Stage 4, and stage 5, one last fold. Past this point, it starts overdriving the signal. Like that. And eventually, at the end, it reaches a square. Kind of a square. And that's the wavefolder at the max value. So here's another cool thing about the wavefolder. It has a symmetry bias knob here. This knob controls an internal reference voltage that is summed with whatever is going into the wavefolder. You can replace the internal voltage with anything using this input. So it can be audio, which will then be mixed in with the sine wave that's going into the wavefolder, or you can completely silence out the sine wave and get whatever is coming in here through the wavefolder with this knob. So as you can see, I am moving some kind of offset, but I can just self-patch the sine wave from oscillator B into this input. And then I get oscillator B through oscillator A's wavefolder, and then I can change this and wavefold it. So these inputs, this one and this one, allow you to put any audio into the wavefolder circuits. So that's it for the wavefolders. A very unclean segue into my next topic. I've been asked by several Worldwave fans and also Worldwave YouTube channel viewers how they can support the project, and I've set up a Patreon earlier this year as I have moved into dedicating my full time to Worldwave. You can support me through Patreon, through buying my songs on Bandcamp. You can help support the project through joining my Discord server and being a part of the community. We have a lot of fun there, a lot of awesome sound design, a lot of good conversation. The Patreon still doesn't have immense amounts of content, but I will be adding more and more as time goes on, and it'll be very worthwhile to be a patron in the future, and I would really appreciate your help through Patreon. Also, subscribe to this channel, comment, share if you want, and follow me on Soundcloud. It's definitely worth it. I'm having a bunch of stuff uploaded there every once in a while, and all of my tracks are released on SoundCloud as well as other platforms, so you can definitely check it out there. Also, follow my story. You can find it on my website through the link that I'm going to put up, and also through Wattpad. Wild Space is an amazing sci-fi story. Most of my music is created surrounding that story, and that's how you can support Worldwave. The CSL gets infinitely more powerful and interesting once you start exploring the internal routing system, accessed by pressing this button here and holding it. Clicking any of these additional buttons activates internal routing of the oscillator's sine waves into the different routing destinations. These two buttons represent the oscillator's wavefolder bias inputs. These two buttons represent the wavefold depth inputs, which are through these attenuverters here. And these two central buttons here represent the FM input of the individual oscillators here. So if I hold this button and click this button, what I'm doing is I'm sending oscillator A's sine wave into oscillator B's wavefolder bias input. And if I quickly plug into the wavefolder final output from oscillator B and turn up the wavefolder bias knob and the index knob to send the modulation through, you'll see that oscillator A is sent through oscillator B's wavefolder here. And then if I turn up the wavefolder knob, you'll see that oscillator B also comes out of this wavefolder in conjunction. This is a very nice way to add and mix waveforms together without using any additional cables. Also, the wavefolder creates this cross-modding relationship between the two oscillators, which is very nice to listen to. So this would be completely oscillator A. This would be oscillator B alone. So an amazing facet now is when you combine sync, you combine FM with wavefolding to create additional ways to cross-mod between waves. So now oscillator A is going straight into oscillator B's wavefolder, but it is also normaled into the FM input of oscillator B by default. So we're going to increase the modulation depth of the normaling . So as you can see, because we're using analog FM, we kind of broke the tonality of it. And when oscillator A is hard synced to oscillator B, you get this nice timbre, which was much more musical and melodic. So here's another example of the internal routing system. We can go into the sine wave output of oscillator B. And normally, the FM inputs are normal to the adjacent oscillator. So when I turn it up, you can see that it starts getting modulated by oscillator A. Focusing back on what we were doing, when we turn up the FM knob, you can see that it's internally normaled. But I can also push the normaling through the index knob here and create CV controllable FM depth. In this case, the FM knob would indicate the maximum value because it's just another attenuator of the FM depth, and the index would indicate the current FM depth that I'm selecting. And then you can always control the index knob from the CV input here, which goes through this attenuverter. Let me quickly build a nice patch to show you how cool this can get. So now I've created this nice internal routing where oscillator B is going into oscillator A's FM input, as well as Oscillator A's Wavefolder bias input. So essentially we're getting the sub mixed in with this nice rich harmonic layer that's going on. And when I turn down the index knob, we can see how the modulation goes away and only Oscillator A goes through the wavefolder. Also, Oscillator A is hard synced to Oscillator B to maintain tonality. I can also activate internal routing of Oscillator B into Oscillator A's wavefolder depth knob. The wavefolder is very sensitive to modulation. So now I can connect an envelope to the CV input of the index knob. Creating these really rich and dirty sounds. And another cool thing is you can then combine the final output with the multiply circuit. Now Oscillator A's final output is going into the multiplication circuit's carrier input, and Oscillator B's sine wave is amplitude modulating, or ring modding in this case, this final output here, controlled by this depth knob. Hooray for a new lighting setup! This is actually a good occasion for me to talk about my favorite aspect of the Instruo CSL, and that's all the interesting stuff you can do with FM. Types of FM that are offered by Instruo CSL are exponential and linear, analog FM, which also have their flaws when compared to digital types of FM and through zero FM, but you can still make a lot of cool stuff when you combine it with sync and when you combine it with the wavefolders there. So what exactly is FM? FM is a term used to describe a relationship between two oscillators where one modulates the frequency of the other. Usually when FM is mentioned, it's used to refer to audio rate modulation of an oscillator's frequency, where the modulation is so fast that it changes the waveform of the carrier. And that's how you can reach all these cool metallic kind of FM tones. But really FM is a very flexible kind of synthesis. And what I want to teach you with this video using Instruo CSL is a bit of the gut feeling of what you're doing exactly when you're using FM. First, we're going to look at exponential versus linear FM. So here we have the sine wave from Oscillator A. We are set to linear mode now, and the attenuator for the FM input, which is internally routed to this sine wave coming from Oscillator B, is at the minimum value. Now we're just going to set Oscillator B to a very low frequency to start exemplifying what FM is like. And I'm going to move the attenuator and show you what Oscillator B is doing to Oscillator A when it's changing its frequency. So first off, let's look at the frequency domain right here. So you can see here in the spectrogram, the sine wave is right here, and Oscillator B is being painted onto the spectrum by changing Oscillator A's harmonics. So you can think of this movement in the harmonics as kind of a scope representing Oscillator B. So if, for example, I use a triangle instead of the sine wave and break the internal normaling here, you'll see that the shape of the modulation changes to a triangle shape. And also you can hear that the character of the modulation kind of changes. So let's just leave the triangle connected in there, kind of lower its frequency for a moment. So when I turn this FM knob here, you see that the depth of the modulation increases. Eventually, with linear analog FM, the carrier reaches this lowest value possible, where it reaches 0 volts and stays at this kind of constant pitch down there. See that? How it stops going in a triangle shape and just maintains this constant pitch. This causes pitch drift in linear FM. So with the CSL's FM, it starts happening at about this kind of 1 o'clock, 1:30 o'clock position of this attenuator here. The coolness in FM starts happening when the modulator becomes fast enough to not just change the frequency of the carrier, but change its wave shape. And now what I want you to look at is this part right here in the spectrum. When I increase the frequency of the modulator, you'll see that beyond a certain frequency, the triangle starts to dig into the sine wave's waveform, and the complex movement in the spectrum turns from this busy, kind of fast thing into just harmonics of a waveform. And the position of these harmonics is controlled by the ratio and the depth. The ratio causes them to spread apart linearly, because this is linear FM. And it also, if you notice, it kind of causes them to bounce off the bottom and go upward after a certain point. That's linear FM. If we increase the depth, we kind of zoom in on the four-man shape. Beyond the 1 o'clock position, the pitch starts drifting upward. And that's the problem with linear FM, that it's kind of hard to keep it musical and go to really crazy depths. Okay, so now let me reduce it back to 0, and now we'll talk about exponential FM. I'll set it to exponential using the switch. And now when we start increasing the depth of the modulation, you'll see that it travels upwards faster and downwards slower because of the exponentiality of this input here now. And this can reach much deeper modulation depths without reaching the oscillator's 0 points. But what it does do, it causes the pitch to drift upward, because the central point of this oscillation in the spectrum, it moves upwards from the fundamental, and less of the original waveform is present at the fundamental frequency. So now let's increase the frequency of oscillator B, and you'll see how this triangle shape in the spectrum starts coalescing into these clean harmonics as it starts digging into the waveform. And now when we increase the depth, you'll see that it drifts upwards. And you get these orderly, fractal four-man shapes. Right there. If we reduce the frequency of oscillator B, it causes the four-mans to coalesce back into the triangle shape. And if we increase the frequency, it increases the size of the four-mans. So if I connect a very weak envelope to oscillator B's FM input and start modulating its frequency, you see how we can make these like very nice four-man-T movements just by changing the ratio. But then the question is, how do we make this melodic? So the thing about FM is, if you don't have a harmonic ratio between the two, where, for example, you have the carrier at 100 hertz and the modulator is at 200 hertz, then the waveform becomes aperiodic and thus atonal. If you listen to this, you can see that there isn't a constant fundamental pitch. Now, with digital applications of this, phase modding is used, where the waveform is modulated within its phase window, thus maintaining the wave's period and thus maintaining its pitch over time, and only changing its wave shape. But here we don't maintain the wave's period. We change the period all the time because these waveforms don't interact with each other. They're independent frequencies that just happen to modulate each other. With the CSL, it's pretty cool. So now I turned on hard sync, and you can see that instantly we have this constant pitch that is controlled by oscillator B. And oscillator A, when you change its ratio, you are actually just changing the sync ratio, not just the FM ratio, creating an upwards movement in the formant, or when you reduce the ratio, it creates a downward movement in the formants. Changing the FM depth also moves the formants around. Now, the special and interesting thing about these formants is that this is what's created by a triangle wave. Now, what happens if instead I choose a square wave? You'll see that because the sine wave has to bounce between 2 points, you get this very clean formant right here, which is repeated across the spectrum going upwards. And between the fundamental and the formant, you have only the artifacts created by traveling between those 2 points. And when I decrease the FM depth, the formants coalesce back into the fundamental. So this really does exemplify what I was talking about when I said that when you're creating an FM relationship, you're essentially painting the modulator onto the spectrum using the carrier. And if we make the sine wave more complex, for example, we use a triangle, you can see all of the harmonics now. If we introduce the square wave modulation again, you can see that all of the harmonics move up and down. So now you have this like line of thinking that goes, wait, so I want these harmonics here and there. When I create this kind of movement in them using the modulator, I can create this kind of format. That's what I want you to understand in your gut feeling. When I increase the frequency of the square wave, it coalesces into harmonics, and you get these format shapes that you can expect where the square wave is in the spectrum. The depth creates this zoom in effect, and the ratio changes the distance between each harmonic and its friend. Also, here's a cool way to make a riser. So now when I turn on hard sync from the square to the triangle, when I increase the FM ratio now let's connect the envelope again. And these little clicky artifacts that you're hearing, you can hear those little clicks. Those are artifacts introduced by the hard sync. Those are actually saw-like artifacts. Now we're getting the sine wave from Oscillator B, and I want to show you what soft sync sounds like in the context of FM. So for this example, I'm going to click the LFO button on because the coarse pitch knob of Oscillator A doesn't go as low as Oscillator B's. And now when I enable modulation, you can see again the change in frequency from Oscillator A. When I increase it, it spreads apart the harmonics, like I said. Increase the depth, it kind of zooms into the formants, and not the harmonics, the formants, right? And now Oscillator B has this kind of harmonic relationship with Oscillator A, where it locks into harmonic interval frequencies with Oscillator A. It gets atonal when you're not in those frequency ranges, but it locks cleanly into them when you find them. And when you increase the depth, it stays rather clean. So you can see that the main pitch is still determined by Oscillator B, but Oscillator A, you can think of it as the root note, and Oscillator B finds this sort of harmonic interval space. It requires a little bit of fine-tuning to catch those spaces, but it sounds nice when you do find them. And as you can see, the FM in linear mode is quite clean from that, until you get to the 0 point that I was talking about. The pitch stays the same. And when I take different wave shapes from Oscillator 1, let's say a sawtooth, I found another harmonic interval for this example. Up until the 0 point, you can see that the modulation is pretty clean. When I go to the sub range, you can see that this is a very nice sub sound. Now what happens when I go exponential, right? So with the exponential mode, you can still stay within this harmonic interval, right? With very nice and orderly. If we go deeper, it kind of breaks that until we find another interval again where it locks. So I would say that linear and exponential FM, while the Oscillator B is soft sync to Oscillator A, creates these very nice sub sounds, just a bass or a sub. And that's just from the sine wave. What if we go to a triangle? You get this nice very nice sound. If I change the modulation from a sawtooth or a triangle, I have to find the ratio again, but once I find it, stays rather stable. So we talked about the oscillators, the wavefolders, sync, the multiplication circuit, FM, the internal routing system, and all those things are all nice and dandy on their own, but the Instruo CSL is the module that allows you to combine all those fun tools together to form a really, truly unique analog sound. And I'll give you some examples of how we can combine these tools together. I'll go for my favorite way to patch this together is to sync it to Oscillator B. Now you have Oscillator A moving within the sync window that Oscillator B is giving it. And the wavefolder is controlling the wavefold amount. And now we exponentially frequency modulate Oscillator A from Oscillator B while it is hard synced to it. We get this like really interesting folded waveform here. If we now use the internal routing system to control the wavefolder amount knob here and increase the index knob, you'll see how in the portions where Oscillator B goes up and increases the frequency of Oscillator A, it also increases the fold amount. We can also flip it so it's more extreme at the lower points of the oscillation of Oscillator B, right? By inverting the modulation. Okay, so I like what this is doing when I'm changing the wavefolder depth amount, but I want to also inject it straight into the wavefolder here using this bias attenuator here. And I'm just going to do that by clicking the shift button and clicking the LFO button. So now Oscillator B is moving through the bias attenuator straight into the wavefolder along with Oscillator A. Now, as well as modulating this wavefolder depth knob, it's also going into the circuit. There it is. All right, now Oscillator A is completely silent, but Oscillator B is being injected in there. I'm just going to put Oscillator A back in there. The wavefolder depth knob, the normal one, which is being modulated by the index. Right? If I change this depth, I'm changing the depth of how much of Oscillator B is being sent into the wavefolder and changing the wave shape. And if I change the sync, I'm changing how many times the sine wave repeats within this modulation window. And the higher the frequency it is, the more repetitions it does. So now if I put an envelope into this, when you're increasing the FM depth, you're moving the formats. When you're changing the wavefold amount, you're smearing them around their central points. Okay, so we talked about the two different oscillators, the character they impart on the different waveforms they put out, the multiplication circuits, the wavefolders, the FM inputs, the internal routing system, and a little bit about the sync. And I'll just start making patches that I have in mind. Alright, so my concept for this patch is, as I said before, the top oscillator, because of hardsync, is better at really like rough, complex waveforms with richer, higher frequencies, really like rougher FM patches than the bottom one, which is better at cleaner waveforms with less complex high frequencies. They're both pretty good at all the things that an oscillator can do. It's just different flavors. So I'm going to use soft sync to actually make a lead here. I'll start from a triangle wave. It sounds like this. Now I'm going to start trying to make these like interesting modulations here. So first, I know that this oscillator is also tuned to C. So I'm asking myself, what happens if I drop this one an octave and make the lead an exact double of that octave and find that harmonic ratio there? And then FM from that, let's see. This seems rather stable, so I think I'll continue from here. Beyond this point, you can see that it kind of breaks the tonality because it does reach the 0 point of the oscillator B's pitch. But really, this point is kind of the sweet spot where it doesn't go to the 0 point and the pitch doesn't break, so I can have this nice movement. Alright, so if I set the knob, I find this point here, that beyond this point it breaks the pitch, and then this would be the maximum amount of FM that can reach from oscillator A to oscillator B. Then I send it through the index here. I do that by holding the internal ratting button and then clicking the sync button here. You can see that when the index knob reaches its maximum value, it hits this spot right here. So now, whatever I do with the index knob, I can't pass the point of no return where the pitch breaks and I have this tonal lead sound. Alright, I'll just use this to sequence a short pattern of notes. I'm not going to cheat and use the ER301 to enhance this in any way. Instead, I'm going to route this through analog stuff, the filters, the VCAs that I have, just to show you what this oscillator can do without digital assistance. Very nice. And now here's another cool thing about the CSL is that, all right, so we're using two outputs for the lead. Now we can actually use this one as a bass. How about to add some extra grit to the bass layer? I can layer some noise onto it using the multiply circuit. So I'll go and bring some noise over, put it into the carrier, and oscillator A is already routed internally to modulate this. And yeah, that's the patch, the lead, and spontaneously I decided to add some bass in there. Endless inspiration from this thing. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed and that it didn't feel too long, although there definitely is so very much to talk about when it comes to this module. I feel like complex ear rack oscillators are an amazing way to explore the basics of electronic sound and basic waveforms, and push them to their limits to produce unique, rich sound design. The Instruo CSL is definitely a star in this category. As you may know, my videos on Eurorack modules so far are not sponsored by anyone. In fact, I make them out of a passion for my favorite modules. But since early 2021, Worldwave has become my full-time job, so consider supporting me through a small monthly donation on Patreon, or purchase high-quality versions of Worldwave tracks on Bandcamp. I promise they're good. Most importantly, be inspired. A Worldwave is a person's influence on the world, rippling out forever, changing the waters until the end of time. You are a part of my ripple of influence. Now, go and make your own. Love, Tom.